So, I mean, just amongst us friends, the potential for Clojure to take over the programming world is obvious, right? But why isn't everyone using it yet? This talk's titled, "What are you waiting for?" And it's about that. So I don't really want to try and sell you on why you should use Clojure. There's a lot of really good resources out there already that do that. And most of us here already know and love Clojure. My goal today is really just to encourage you to hurry up and start using it at work. And so during this talk, I'll be introducing an open source training course. It's called Enterprise Clojure Training. And Elango is going to be speaking a bit about his experiences using and teaching Clojure. So you might ask, well, why did we build a course? And the answer is that a company asked me to take 28 developers and get them ready to use Clojure day one. These were all professional programmers, but they didn't know Clojure at all. They were going to be working on some big back-end data systems. And so, yeah, challenge accepted. Let's try it out. And hence, Enterprise Clojure Training was born. It is an open source training course for Clojure. The target audience is software engineers. They're going to be using Clojure professionally. They need to be productive really quickly within a week. It's a very practical focus. We're talking about files, databases, and for this team, Hadoop was a big thing because they were going to be doing a lot of data processing. And if it's not obvious already, this was a boot camp, so try and get people up and running really quickly. So the program was 2 days and 10 hours each day. We had 12 sessions altogether, and we took 1 hour for lunch every day. There are also 2 follow-up webinars, which lasted 2 hours each, which gave people an opportunity to come back with bigger questions after they'd had a chance to absorb the material. And the sections themselves were comprised of a mini lecture, which I'd start out with, and that would usually take 15 to 25 minutes. We'd spend a bit of time doing exercises, so they'd work on some exercises relevant to the material. And then once they were done with that, we'd spend 10 minutes reviewing my answers and their answers and discussing good things and bad things about them. And then we'd have a snack break. And some people obviously get ahead of other people, so there was also a set of challenges. If someone was killing it, they could go and work on a bigger challenge, and those were kind of just a pervasive thing they could spend some time doing. So I'll dive in and show you some of the course material, which it consists of slides for when I was presenting the mini lectures. There was a manual which we printed out so that they could follow along during the lecture, but also the manual contains the exercises, so they would work off that. And then the webinar slides and some example code to go with that. So I'll show you the content. There's also some videos I'm working on. I do want to put this up online. I've done 6 out of 12 of the seminars, but I haven't released them publicly yet because I want it to be consumable as a full thing before I do that. So let's have a look at some of the content.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely. Jump in.
What would motivate a company to send their developers to this course? I mean,
Yeah.
assuming if they don't use Clojure now,
Yeah.
what would motivate them to say, "Oh, we want to use Clojure again"? Send the developers here.
Well, I think there's 2 answers. The first answer is I don't know. They just wanted they wanted to train this group of 28 people, and so they they paid for it, and I did it. The second answer is which I intend to talk about at length in the second half of this talk, is that I think Clojure is just a really great fit for a lot of companies, especially. I mean, this company especially was doing very data-oriented back-end stuff. Which was just a good match for Clojure. So I think there are good reasons why companies would choose Clojure. Yeah, I'm not, yeah, so. Yeah, let's look at some of the material. So this is the website where you can also access the material. And this is the manual in HTML form. So you can just get a feel for, you know, it's a book essentially, broken up into 12 parts. And interspersed at the end of every section, there are some examples. So I'll just, exercises, I'll just take us through to the exercises here. And then the idea is you're not meant to cheat and look at the next page until you actually try it out. This is just the same thing, but as a PDF. It just looks nicer when you print it out. These are the slides, which, yeah, so, you know, there's the 12 sections. I start out the first section, we just talk about the ecosystem, which is like Lineagen, setting up your system, what the REPL is, how to include libraries, installation. I did ask everyone to pre-install the software, but obviously that never happens, so you have to spend a bit of time actually getting everyone up and running. And then syntax, obviously, is you know, introducing people to, you have to use prefix notation and just what the basic constructs of the language are. We talk a bunch about functions next, how to structure functions mainly, and dive pretty quickly into testing. I wanted to start with a foundation of testing instead of bringing it in at the end there, because I just think in a professional context, it's something you want to start as soon as possible. And we talk about control flow, you know, ifs, cases, cons, all that sort of stuff. Functional programming is my favorite section, which is really a catch-all. A lot of the content's in here. So we talk a lot about sequences in there and the importance of pure functions and what a pure function is and why you'd want to use it. And also, you know, the fundamentals like map, reduce. Bryce, yeah. Go ahead. Oh, that's all good.
So one of the things that I'm kind of curious about is when you did this with the 28 developers, were they already sold on the premise of Clojure, or at least the premise of functional programming? One of the things that I sort of see a lot is that a lot of people don't necessarily see the need to it. And I'm kind of curious what it's like at, you know, step 6, getting into functional programming, and what the reaction is.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, like, I would say, no, they weren't sold on Clojure. A lot of them were kind of thinking, oh, this is just another thing I kind of have to learn. But I'll also say that people really got into it quite quickly, and like within like the first quarter of the course, like people's engagement was pretty high. So they were obviously enjoying it. There were a lot of questions that they asked about, like, well, what are the use cases for Clojure? When should we use Clojure? And that sort of thing, which is for me a very hard question to answer, because I see Clojure as just this general purpose language that I want to use for everything. So I kind of say, well, whatever you want to do, use Clojure for it. And that's not really a satisfactory answer for them. So I would share with them use cases of where I'd used Clojure in my work and where it had been helpful for us, and they seem to appreciate that. Was there more to your question that I missed there?
No, that's very interesting.
Okay. Okay, cool. Right. Yeah, so Java interrupt, boring, but necessary. Concurrency, polymorphism. Databases is, I like this section a lot, because we have, well, I think it's a neat little exercise where it uses HSQL, the embedded database, and you can like insert stuff and delete stuff without having to have a whole lot of stuff installed. So spec and macros, these sections are necessary because the client asked for it, and most people are really interested when they hear about Clojure. They want to know about spec and macros for whatever reason. They're just popular topics. In my opinion, they're not very useful for a professional programmer day one. Like, they're really great things that, like, as you become an expert, you will use, but day one, you've got more practical concerns. So yeah, I'll just say that I focused on mainly identifying what a macro is and how to treat it differently, as opposed to like going deep into how to write a macro, which I think is.
About the databases, you
Yeah.
mentioned, I think the HSQL, was that HoneySQL?
No. No, so I'm referring to an embedded database that you can. It's kind of it comes with Java. You can just use it. It's kind of like yeah, it's just like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So and then a reading list. I'll just kind of show you some of the slides. They're just like the slides I'm going to do today. So there's really nothing. To see here. Most of you know Clojure, so there's no point really showing much of that. And then I did want to show you some of the advanced topics, which is like what we covered in the webinar, more because it just shows like the kind of questions that people came back with after the course, which I just think is interesting. And there are a lot of questions about spec. So we covered, we went over some detailed examples of using spec. There is also some questions about mocking, which is good. There are some questions about how to set up build processes, how to use Jenkins. So as part of the examples, which I'll just show you quickly, there's some examples up here that show how you can make a doc. It's got like a Docker file in there for setting up a Jenkins build server and that sort of thing to answer these questions. There are questions about web services, questions about Gen class, what it means, how you make jars. They're interested in more examples, specifically about Hadoop, and yeah, that's probably all we need to go over there. Yeah, this communicating services little example was fun to go through with them because it sets up multiple services, which is one of those things it's not often covered, but when you want to use Clojure at work, suddenly you have to do. And so it kind of explains how to set up a Docker Compose file, which will allow you to start up multiple services in a reproducible way, and how to connect those services and talk to them. And so it's got a very basic Composure web request for each of these services, and they just talk to each other. All right, so yeah, let's go back to that. That's the all this stuff really. I should have opened this earlier, but yeah, I just want to show you that the YouTube videos are there, ready to go once I finish off some more. Yeah, so just to kind of harp on this value of questions thing, people had a lot of questions, obviously, and it was really evident that being able to answer those questions quickly helped people a lot, and often there would be like really tricky questions hard up against like really easy questions, but pretty much everyone in the room would benefit from like someone asking a question and getting an answer. And there was a lot of content that I just didn't think about when I was preparing the content that the answers drew out. So being able to help people with the unexpected, being able to like see the pace that people were going through the course, like, oh, everyone's finished that set of exercises, so let's just move on to the next bit. Or people are really struggling with this particular concept, we're going to have to take a bit more time to maybe explain it from a different angle or whatever. And being able to share use cases of like, well, why are we learning this? Like, how does this help me in the real world? Being able to kind of relate that back to an instance in my work where, oh, this scenario, I was able to use it and it helped me out a lot. just meant we were able to get through, we were able to cover a lot of ground. And the reason I'm harping on this is because I want this course, Enterprise Clojure Training, to be a resource for teachers, more so than a course that people just go to online and do. This is intended for if you want to run a course, someone or something like that, this is a resource for you. And so that leads me into talking a little bit about the building of the course material. Because I want this to be a resource for teachers, it was very important to me that it would be adaptable course material. It should be easy to access, open source. You can use it, you can modify it, and I'd love it if you contribute to it as well. And to that end, I thought it'd be interesting to kind of have a look under the hood of what Enterprise Clojure Training is from a tooling perspective, and it's all built as ASCII Doc documents. And what ASCII Doc is it's a flavor of Markdown, but it's better for publishing, so you can make books and that sort of thing. It has really excellent tooling support, and it's compatible with GitHub and GitHub Pages. So when I say it's a flavor of Markdown, I just mean it's literally just text. Like most people use Markdown. ASCII Doc is very similar to Markdown. You put your titles, you put your sentences, you put lists, you put images, links, you put code indented. And I find this working with text much more convenient than working with like Word or PowerPoint or whatever, because you can cut your sentences out and move them around if you just have them on one line and that sort of thing. It's quite convenient.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Do you know offhand if that flavor of Markdown is the same one that GitHub uses?
So GitHub will render ASCII Doc just the same way it will render Markdown. So they are different formats, but GitHub supports both.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's have a look at what the kind of documents look like, which is to say text files. Looks like markup. Unfortunately the slides cut off here, but I won't talk too much about that then. So that was the manual. This is the slides, and as you can see, the slides are just delimited with titles. Oh, you can't see because it's cut off. It's just text. To your point in the question, you can make READMEs with it. You can make web pages with it, like the index to the site that you saw earlier is an ASCII Doc document, and it renders really nicely. So I encourage you, if you use Markdown, consider using ASCII Doc. It's pretty good. So I said it's better for publishing, and what exactly do I mean by that? Well, the thing that I love about it is that it makes an automatic table of contents, which if you've ever done anything like write a book or whatever is just a nightmare, in my opinion, with a lot of tools. But ASCII Doc does it really well. First of all, it just automatically aggregates them, but you can annotate certain parts of your document to not be in the table of contents. So you can control what's in the table of contents in that manner. And you can choose to render it as a side panel or at the top. You have a lot of customization available to you in the table of contents. Obviously, I love it because I can create a book, I can create slides, I can create web pages, and the output can be HTML, PDF, DocBook, EPUB. You can make tables, you can do code highlighting, you can do style customization. And my favorite feature is it does these little icons when you make a note or a tip or whatever. And I said it has excellent tooling, and the things I like about the tooling is it's, in my opinion, it produces pretty attractive content by default. You can install it really easily. There's lots of options for you. There's plenty of editor plugins. Chrome has a great plugin as well. And so I'll just show you, this is my favorite editor, IntelliJ, and as you can see with the plugin, it renders stuff right beside where I'm editing my text, which is pretty nice. The Chrome plugin, actually I think I can show you what that does. So like this document here in the raw form, if I turn my plugin on, it renders it. And what's neat about that is you can actually point it to a file on your system. Whenever you change the file, it's just going to re-render it marked up, which means if you prefer to use Emacs or Vim, this is a great way to see what it's going to look like, and it'll instantly refresh. The slides are a little bit tricky because I used a plugin to generate them so that I'd have some nice features. And it's based on Reveal.js. There's a plugin for it. The only reason I bring this up is that there is a build step. So if you end up going down this step, going down this path, I just wanted to let you know that you have to do an additional build step. But you can automate that to also be reactive using this neat little tool called Event Notified Test Runner, ENTR. And it's a really simple tool. All it does is it watches for file changes, and it'll run a command on that file that changed. And so this is like useful in a lot of different contexts. Obviously, if you want to run your tests or whatever. But in this case, I just have a little script that's going to recompile my slides whenever I change stuff. And then to deploy it to the website, you can rely on GitHub to just do it as part of its Jekyll integration. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. It just means that it's going to render your doc for you. But for me, I ended up making a little deploy script just because I wanted the slides with, yeah. So the neat thing about having this set up as a Travis CI task is that it means I can just edit my text, push my text up to GitHub, and then the website's updated, the slides are all updated. So you don't have to install any tools to contribute to this project if you want to. You just have to be able to edit text. Oh, right. So, I mean, there are existing training options, and I wanted to quickly plug this page on the Clojure Community site, which lists a bunch of training options if you're interested in training. It's a good resource. If you have a course and it's not on here, please list it. It's very easy to list it there. They're all really good options, but for me, they didn't provide the training material that I could use to run my course, and they didn't feel very enterprisey, so that's why I kind of made my own. So maybe we'll switch. Oh, sorry. Switch back to just talking about the process of delivering a course. So I've had the opportunity to help a lot of people learn Clojure through this course, but more so through pairing with people at work. And I wanted to share a bit of my observations about the learning process specific to Clojure. I firmly believe that anyone can learn Clojure, but it definitely is a challenge. I would say it's more of a challenge than some other languages. So I want to talk a bit about why that is. And I believe that it takes a bit of a change of thinking to really get into Clojure, and that there's this kind of mental shift that is required. And when I say a mental shift, what I'm really talking about is when we're programming in Clojure, often we're thinking in sequences, we're thinking in maps, we're thinking in sets and vectors, in data structures, we're thinking in aggregation, and everything's a function. Everything you want to do is a function. We're passing around like loads of arguments and big data as arguments, and these are quite things that are foreign to a lot of people coming from other programming languages. And I know this kind of mental shift took me personally a long time. I was using Clojure just to try and write code my way. Why is everyone doing it differently? But some people get it really quickly. I've worked with I mean, there's one particular person who joined the company I was working at, didn't know Clojure, but within 2 weeks they were productive, and within a couple of months they were an expert and one of the strongest contributors on the team. So it's definitely something that people can do quickly. I think it helps to check your preconceptions at the door and just kind of embrace the idioms of the language. And I think for when we're teaching Clojure, it's very easy for us to forget our own path to enlightenment and forget that new users face really difficult obstacles. And this was kind of driven home to me when I was recording the video for a setup for this course, because I thought, okay, I'm just going to install Java, Lineagen, IDE, this is going to be easy, right? And so like I started recording and I installed Java and I'm like, oh, which version do I want to get? And like that's, if you don't choose 1.8, you're in for a world of hurt. And the defaults these days is not 1.8. I mean, if you choose the JRE, it's just not going to work. You need the JDK. Okay, so assuming you get the Java installation right, what if you've already got Java installed? Now, like, are you choosing the right one? Yeah, go ahead.
Another question, sorry,
Yeah.
going back just a step.
Yeah.
The difficulties you were saying people were having learning Clojure, would those be common to any move from imperative to functional programming, or is there something special about Clojure that made it more difficult?
Right, so the question is there anything special about Clojure that makes it more difficult as opposed to any other functional language? And I would hope there's nothing special about Clojure. I don't really know the answer. I haven't taught any other languages, and I haven't seen people struggle with it. I can certainly relate my own experience, which is that I've found other functional languages to not be as different as I found Clojure. So when I came to Clojure, I found it to be a bigger change of thinking than other languages that had functional features, at least. Maybe not purely so I do think that the mental jump is a little bit bigger, for what it's worth. Yeah.
Related question.
Yeah.
Do you find that people who have no experience with Java struggle more than those who come having, used Java since before it was called Oak?
I don't have any empirical evidence to back up what I'm going to say, but I will say that in my opinion, people who know Java really well struggle more than people who don't know it.
Even though they can read the stack traces?
Yeah. That's my opinion. It's just based on teaching my nephew to program Clojure. He didn't know anything, and also some people I catch up with now and then who have varying backgrounds in programming. People who went straight to Clojure generally had less hang-ups about what's going on here. But at the same time, I do think there's something to be said for experience and understanding Java. I don't think it holds people back as such. I do think there are some people who don't fully embrace Clojure and put it away, and that's fine. I mean, it's not for everyone. And I think those people tend to be focused on the benefits that Java can provide them, there are a lot of benefits that modern Java can provide. So I think part of, if you want to embrace Clojure, you kind of have to say, I'm turning my back on a lot of good stuff for a while, and it's gonna be a hard path doing without that. Right, so yeah, then Lineagen. Okay, so the course was on Windows, and I tried to install Lineagen, and Lineagen just would not install. There was a security error, and it's okay. Fortunately, I knew that I could just use my browser to download the jar file and put it in the right directory, but like if you see, the error was not pretty. And then, okay, I got past that, and so now I'm installing IDEA, and there's a few tricks there as well. You've got to configure your SDK correctly. You've got to make sure you get cursive, and oops, now your parens don't behave how you're used to them behaving. So, there are some things to be explained before people can get up and running. So anyway, the point here is that I actually had to record the video 10 times before I got a clean installation path of this is what I do. And that was really humbling. And I guess I realized, beginners face some big problems. And the reason I bring all of this up is just to say, objectively, I think it's fair to call Clojure a user-hostile environment. The error messages, the tooling setup is quite difficult. Obviously, us in this room, we can all see beyond these difficulties because we've got past them. But when you're with beginners, a little empathy goes a long way. And often they get blocked by things that are really quickly resolved with a question. And as a teacher, it's really important to be sympathetic to that. And also acknowledge things aren't perfect so that they're comfortable coming to you and saying, oh, I can't get this to work. I have a couple of tips for people who are trying to learn Clojure. I always try and emphasize that they should focus on the language first, just the syntax and the constructs. And I tell them about the mental shift, but I encourage them not to try and get there too early because it can actually hamper their learning. Sometimes people can get into a phase where they're kind of overthinking it. They're going, oh, but how do you do it the Clojure way? And I find it's better for them to just write code. And I encourage people to delay investing in tools and editors and learning special key combinations as much as possible. But definitely join the community, find a teacher, ask questions. The Clojure community is very welcoming and open. Obviously practice, read code. This one I want to emphasize doubly because Clojure is a language where you have the opportunity to read code. The code's concise, so whenever I use a library, I've made it a habit that I'll just navigate to the source of the library and take a quick look at it. And I find that habit really helped me because I'd seen different styles of Clojure being used in different contexts, and I'd say, oh, actually, the thing that I thought was complex is really easy. That's a really neat solution. And that extends even to Clojure core functions. I encourage you to kind of navigate to the source of those and check them out because they're actually pretty approachable. So more so than any other language, I would say reading code is good in Clojure. For Clojure is definitely the best resource for practice examples to work on because it's also got a corpus of good answers that people have made. There's 10 answers for every question. So once you finish a question, you can compare it to others and again read examples. And read and follow the style guide. That's just kind of part of embracing the idioms of Clojure. Yeah.
2 questions about the style guide. Is that the one by Dave Atza?
Sorry, could you repeat?
The style guide that
Style
you're
guide.
referring to, the one by
Yes.
Clojure?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then on the note of tools and editors,
Yes.
Obviously the people that you're teaching had to use some editor while they were learning.
Yep.
Did you encourage them to just use whatever editor they were using before?
That's a good question. The question is about the editor we used in the course,
You
and
mentioned installing IntelliJ.
yeah, so it was a real sticking point for the course actually because prior to the course I said, oh, you need this stuff installed. They had an IT department that didn't want to install certain stuff, so in the end, kind of the thing we agreed that they could install was Lighttable, and Lighttable is okay, but it's not what I'd encourage a professional programmer to use in their day job, and also it just flat out doesn't work with the database example that I wanted to run through with them. So there's a couple of problems there. But when I was there, it actually turned out that they could use IntelliJ and they could install Cursive. So we quickly got them up and running using that instead. In my opinion, that's a really good starting point because aside from the parentheses management, which you can turn off, it's a complicated IDE, but as long as you know how to do the action command, you can figure out most things.
Did you consider introducing them to Parainfer?
Well, I think if Parainfer is a good option, and to be honest, I was kind of just in a rush mode because like I thought we were going to be using Lighttable, and then suddenly we switched to using IntelliJ. So I was just happy that we had an editor. I didn't give a whole lot of thought to, well, should I encourage them to use Parainfer or not? I like Parainfer. Yeah, I don't have much to say about that, though. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, so joining the community, the Clojureverse is a really good online forum. People are very friendly. It's very organized. There are threads. People are generally very responsive. Stack Overflow, you'll usually get an answer to your question really quickly if you tag it with Clojure script. The Google group Clojure is much bigger in terms of the readership, but I think the cadence is a bit slower. So it's generally not used for question-answer style stuff. Clojurians is a Slack channel that if you really like chatting with people. I discourage people from using it because you lose all your history, and I'd prefer those kind of conversations to be recorded, but it's also a good place just to chat with people, so it's good for that. Right, so my goal today really is to encourage you to hurry up and start using Clojure at work. And so part one of this was about providing a resource, providing a course to help companies do that. And part two, I want to share my path to Clojure. And to do that, I have to kind of start with how I first came to Clojure. So in 2007, I was a bit of a know-it-all kind of a programmer, and I was hiring an engineer, and the code submission was really concise and elegant, and I didn't understand it at all, and I was like, what? It was in this language I didn't know. I thought I knew all the languages. I knew C, I knew C++, I knew Java. It's not all of them, obviously. Yeah, so I thought, well, maybe this is kind of one of those weird languages we learn at university. Maybe it's Prolog or Haskell, and it turned out to be Lisp. And I thought, well, fine, I can program in any language. I'll just learn the constructs. And so 6 months later, I was sick of Lisp. I was ready to put it back in its box. I wasn't having a good time of it. I went through SICP and on Lisp, and I'd written small programs, and I was like, yeah, this is elegant, and the concepts are really good, but it just didn't do the kind of computations that I wanted to do. And so for me, it wasn't practical. And then this happened. Clojure came out. Rich announced Clojure. I was instantly hooked because I could actually build stuff. I could, grab a Java library, and I was rendering 3D stuff. I was like, wow, I can actually build stuff I'm interested in. And on the flip side, I got introduced to new concepts that I just was like, wow, that's weird. Like fnil is this function that you can use to take another function, and then if any of its arguments are nil, you can replace it with some other value. And I was like, that's weird, but good. And like I found that I could use that in a lot of scenarios, and I saw that it was a very expressive language, and I could be effective using it. But it wasn't an option for my day job. It was just for personal projects. Then in 2010, I was managing a team of 12 people. We were building logistics software. It was all using C#. We're an agile shop, and so we did a lot of we're agile with a capital A, so we did a lot of tracking of things. And I actually built a bunch of like custom reports and in Clojure, and I built some prototypes in Clojure, but it wasn't something I was using for the product, the core product. And I kept looking at our core product and thinking, oh, the technical challenges that I'm facing here would just be so much easier to approach in Clojure. But how am I going to transition my team over to using Clojure from C#? And I just didn't think it was possible to do on my own. So I think like one of the things that prevents companies from sliding into Clojure is what prevented me. It's that there's this big obstacle here. How can I get my team up and running on Clojure quickly? I just felt like it was too much to do on my own. I needed training, I needed another expert, I needed C-level buy-in, and it was hard to believe that you can switch languages effectively without some help. And I think, you do need some help. and that's kind of part of the motivation for why I wanted to put this course out there. Another kind of thing that I felt at that time was that I was kind of a bit of a weirdo whenever I talked about Clojure, because people just didn't know Clojure in my team, and so I think it's kind of natural for people to be suspicious of what you don't know, and they have real concerns like, oh, is it really better? Is it for regular programmers? Can we learn it? Who's going to support it? Can we hire people? And why are you wasting your time on something so obscure? And just explaining it to everyone, it just isn't enough, because they want to see it more than that. In 2010, there weren't a whole lot of Clojure jobs. Now there are. So I think in the past there's been this feeling of, well, what are developers waiting for to get into Clojure? Well, we need jobs, right? And there is starting to become a lot of Clojure jobs available if you look for them. The Google group has a policy that you can post a job. You just need to label it with JOB. And there's quite a few postings in there. And employers, I encourage you to take advantage of that if you're looking for Clojure engineers. Clojure for the Brave and True runs a job board, and this is taken from that. And that's quite active. And certainly, every time I go to the Clojure Conj, people are hiring aggressively. Everyone you speak to is like, why don't you come work for us? Why don't you come work for us? So there's definitely jobs out there. And obviously the sponsors of Clojure Conj and the attendees are good people to talk to if you're looking for work. What are companies waiting for? I think there's been in the past a perception that it's hard to hire Clojure developers. I think it's probably still partially true if you take the kind of standard recruitment agency approach where you like farm out, oh, go find me a Clojure programmer. But if you use the channels I mentioned just previously, you'll definitely get a lot of interest. I know, like at my current work and previous work, when you advertise for Clojure, you get a lot of applicants. Clojure is a perk. It's not a barrier. People are attracted to it. And kind of one last thing on this is that you don't have to hire for Clojure specifically. People can pick it up. A good programmer is going to pick it up quickly, very quickly. Learners, the first question you get from a beginner is, what language should I learn? And the standard answer to that is always, well, you should learn JavaScript, you should learn Java, and you should learn Python. I want to make the case that Clojure is a better tool for Thort. It focuses on maps, sets, and vectors, which are like the fundamental data structures. It's very concise for algorithm expression. And it focuses on the important concepts. You don't have a whole lot of baggage. You don't have boilerplate. There's not a lot of distractions. And so I believe you can reach mastery of algorithmic concepts much faster using Clojure. Another concern for learners is the supply and demand. And I just want to say, like, supply and demand isn't as simple as the most used. Like, the most popular market, JavaScript, is also the most average market. So if you're looking for an imbalance in supply and demand, you're really going to find that in smaller markets like Clojure. So it's a good language to learn for that reason. And lastly, like, the future is the future. Personally, I've used a different programming language in every single job I've worked at. And I didn't know the language before I took the job either. And like, it's not certain what you're going to be writing in the future. And so it's not valuable to avoid learning another language. Like, it's good to learn one or two. Like, you should probably learn a few. And good employers are always going to value skills, knowledge, and culture over a specific technology. So yeah, I just want to make a plug to optimize for optimize for computer science mastery, not for what's most popular. Employees often are waiting for like this greenfield project. We're going to make this awesome thing from Clojure from scratch once we find the right project. We're going to have room to do it right. We're going to figure out how it should be done properly. So I just want to kind of say, why not use Clojure for some boring stuff as well? I think employers, when they look at Clojure, often think, well, I'd love to have kind of a framework I can kind of get started with. I want to have some structure. Then I want to bring people in and they can add to that and work with it. So there's kind of these competing goals here is what I'm trying to get at. And just on that point, I mean, it's totally possible to get a framework up and running quickly. There's lots of Clojure experts out there now contracting. There's Cognitech. There's all sorts of options if you do want to say, oh, I want to build like a framework that I can get people around. So 2014, I joined a Clojure startup. This was an enterprise-facing Clojure startup. We built an entirely new product using Clojure and Clojure Script. And during that time, I discovered, well, Clojure scales. It works in large teams, works in large code bases, can handle heavy data throughput. We were able to build initial products in a matter of months, and training people wasn't hard at all. We had a lot of people who didn't know any Clojure. Recruiting was really easy. And the thing I loved was that I could use the same idioms on the front end and the back end. It felt very comfortable to move throughout the whole code base, like between projects. It was all kind of the same concepts. So it's very pleasant to work in that environment. And also switching teams. I switched teams a couple of times, and I was able to adapt to the code base really easily. And it was maintainable. I mean, yeah, it's still up and running today. In 2018, I joined Sweetness, and this is a customer-facing Clojure startup. And Sweetness is a place where you can book rooms. If you try and book a suite that has 2 rooms, it's often very expensive. It's more expensive than booking 2 individual rooms. So what we do is we provide a way of booking 2 individual rooms that connect up to each other, which is effectively a 2-bedroom suite. So families love this, and people doing group travel love it, because you can, if you have your family, you can have a little bit of your own space, and you can have your kids next door or whatever. It's all built on Clojure and Clojure Script, and that makes recruiting really easy. We get a lot of interest, and it's a very productive tech stack for us. I'll just play this little video because my explanation.
It's probably not as good as the video.
So I often wonder to myself, well, is Clojure enterprise? And for me it is, because I get to use it at work every day. I was able to build enterprise systems with it, and I know that many large companies are using it. And I know that companies are recruiting for Clojure experience. And you know, it's getting popular. I mean, you can see it's making its way up towards the more popular end of the graph, right? But at the same time, you know, it is a niche. It's, you know, dwarfed by, just within the Java world, you know, it's 3% of the JVM languages. It's second to Java, but that's a really small piece of the pie. So it's definitely a niche. It's a secret weapon, and that's okay with me. I think the community generally values principles over popularity, you know, the principles of simplicity, thinking, and community. And you might ask, well, does it really matter? In some sense it doesn't, but the reason I care is that Clojure makes me happy, and I want you to be happy too. I think there's lots of obstacles and there's uncertainty, but there's also opportunity. And I see Clojure adoption as being this really challenging knot to approach. So in 333 BC, Alexander the Great marched his army into Gordium in modern-day Turkey, and he encountered an ancient wagon. It was tied with knots so tightly entangled that it was just impossible to see how they were fastened. And tradition held that the wagon had once belonged to Gordius, the father of the celebrated King Midas. An oracle had declared that anyone who could unravel the elaborate knots was destined to become the ruler of all Asia. And Alexander proclaimed, "It makes no difference how they are loosed." He drew his sword and cut through them with a single stroke. So yeah, I think the Gordian Knot is a story that we can take inspiration from. You know, don't overthink it, see past implied limitations, and be decisive. So I want to encourage you that Clojure is a great choice for your company. There are lots of books out now. There's a great community. There's a bunch of experts out there. And there's training options. And you can build better stuff faster. So hopefully my training course can give you some confidence to get started. And I'd love to help you get a strong start. I want to encourage you, start using Clojure already. There's a link to the slides, and Elango has been collaborating with me on the course, and he's going to be talking a little bit now about his experiences. So I'll just stop the share, and we should be able to see him.
Cool. Can you guys see me okay?
Sure.
Alrighty. So like Tim said, my name is Elango. So I currently work at Google in the internationalization group. But as a disclaimer, these are my personal views. I've also taught a Clojure workshop in the past, and also a couple of Clojure Bridge workshops, and worked on Clojure Bridge material as well, in addition to collaborating with Tim on a bunch of Clojure and education type efforts like this. So yeah, I just wanted to share some of my experiences and observations. So when it comes to like using Clojure or things related to it, I currently am working at Google proper, but before I was working at Nest, which kind of was like in and out in this alphabet setup, and now it's in again. But I joined Nest, I guess 4 years ago. And the reason why is because I had already been using Clojure. I really liked it. I wasn't able to use it in the job prior to Nest. And I was looking for a company that would either do Clojure or something similar. And I noticed, and I knew that Nest in the backend services was using Scala. And I said, well, Scala is a functional programming language that runs on the JVM. It's close enough. So if it's good, if it's interesting, if it satisfies a lot of other interests and requirements in mind, then that's good enough, and that's how and that's where I ended up. And in hindsight, looking back on it, I mean, I still think I made the right choice. So I was there for 3.5 years, and if you guys attended the conj last year, you may have noticed Nest was a sponsor, so that was me. So like I said, when I was at Nest, I was working on the back end. I was working on the data services team. So if any of you are playing buzzword bingo, that would be IoT, big data analytics. So hopefully you're halfway to winning. But yeah, that's basically what I would do. I would take the raw events from the thermostats, I would aggregate them using distributed computing frameworks that change over time. What we use, but I would aggregate these things and then put it into a form that was easy either for me to use or especially for other people within the company to use. So within the data team, it was really interesting. Like, you know, I guess what you would call, what we did would be data engineering, not the machine learning, data sciencey kind of stuff, but more just the distributed computing, just to like get data and harness it and make it attractively computational. So an observation from some of the more senior people on the team was in the systems that we used, how reliable they were. And when I was hearing those observations, I know, and you know, they would sometimes say, kind of allude to the fact that the language that they were written in kind of implies how they behave. So for example, the systems that I started using when I first joined, like they were Hadoop, they were Kafka, and then they were and Storm. And eventually we started using Spark instead of Hadoop in certain places. And then after that, we switched over to like GCP things like Dataflow. But at a time, it was like, it was this cobbled together collection of various frameworks and tools. And so, Hadoop was very Hadoop. You could find so many things in that ecosystem, and they were all good enough or mostly good. It's just a grab bag of things, and sometimes it can be flaky, but hey, everybody's using it, right? Kafka was great. It's very cutting edge, but it was also really flaky. And please don't have to upgrade from like 0.8.4.2.1 to 0.8.4.2.2 because you never know what that's going to do. So it's good when it works, but when it doesn't work, hopefully you can recover. And Storm was solid. You create a topology, you write it in Java, you run it, you create your jar file, you upload it to the Storm cluster, and it runs. It's just and then you kind of just forget about it. It's pretty solid stuff. And as you can imagine, Hadoop was written in Java, Kafka was in Scala, and Storm was written in Clojure in the core. And then Spark came along, and that was also written in Scala. And Spark was great when it worked for you, but I was the first person who tried to do something that didn't work in Spark because, silly me, I was trying to do a group by. And that's when the whole narrative of Spark is so great. Like there's always that one example of this iterative machine learning model that you're trying to do. And I'm like, well, I want to do a group by because it's a very, we have these individual devices. What one device does has no bearing on, the device in the guy next door's house, right? So I need to group by. And they're just like, well, you're doing it wrong. If you need group by. I'm like, oh, okay. So it's just interesting to see how language isn't something like you can do any program in any language, but the language somehow has this characteristic that kind of seeps through into the things that are written in it. So what I noticed working around all these really, really smart people was that who also were like, they had a lot of experience with Java and especially Scala, and some people are really into Scala, is I saw evidence of what Paul Graham has called the blub paradox, which is, languages can have various levels of power in this kind of continuum of from less powerful to more powerful. And as an example, Bash or even assembly would be very low powered language. Like the expressivity of those languages is very low. You compare that to Perl, and now you can be more expressive. You can write the same thing in fewer lines. Java, you can imagine you can do things in Java that are just a lot more sophisticated and and so on. So here I am working with a bunch of people who are Scala programmers. They've come from Java, perhaps. They've seen the light. They're like, oh man, functional programming. And, Scala is kind of a statically typed functional programming language. So it's more of the Haskell tradition. So it's kind of intuitive for Java programmers to kind of take that next step, going from Java to Scala. And, then they're starting to kind of have that paradigm shift that Tim was talking about. And here I come along and I'm just like, well, I need to monitor this thing I'm developing. So my Scratch language, just kind of like a throwaway program that I need to write to monitor what's going on. And my language of choice was Clojure, because I'm like, all things being equal, if I have to write Ruby code or Python code or whatever it is, it's going to be more concise than Clojure. So I got a REPL, so I'm going to do that. This guy walks by and he's like, hey, what's that craziness? What are all these parentheses? And I was like, oh yeah, Clojure. And they're like, oh, that's really weird, that's such a weird language. And I'm thinking to myself, it's strange that these two languages, Scala and Clojure, they're both functional programming languages on the JVM. They both, have immutable data types and, persistent immutable data types. It's just, they're closer to each other than they are to any other language. And yet it was just kind of like, I don't understand. And I guess that's part of the, if you're at a certain level of power, you don't understand what's the benefit of languages of a higher power. So to you don't really see them as better, more powerful. Better is not the right word, but, and so there's that paradox, and I was experiencing it firsthand. So, and there's just this irony because the people I worked with there were just so smart. I never worked with people like that before. And yet they were kind of resistant. Why should I bother? So I would find ways to create little side projects, not because I thought that they would actually be willing to put this stuff into production, but almost sometimes they were just completely personal projects that I really just wanted to work on for my own sanity and enjoyment. Sometimes there were projects that were relevant to work, and I wanted to do something that I know couldn't be done any other way and were actually still useful or necessary. So there are a few examples I can give you. One example that I chose for today, just for right now, was I created this random data generator. So there was a person sitting next to me and he's like, oh man, I'm trying to train these models on this huge data set. So I got this distributed job, but I need random data of a certain type. And I have a schema, but, and I was like, huh, well, I know about, test.check, and I could probably do that for you. And so, with 250 lines of code, I basically wrote a program where the input is a schema file, and it could be a nested schema file. You could have a schema within a schema. You can have enums and all these various types, and it doesn't matter. That's the input. The output is basically a generator that just generates random data adhering to that type. And I remember creating that program, and then maybe a couple months later going to the Hadoop conference, the Hadoop Summit in 2015. And some guy actually presented something in that same vein where he's like, hey, I've just created this thing where you can generate random test data for your Hadoop cluster. And I was like, is it really random? Is it random? And I kind of described the contours of the output that my program would generate. Is it is it truly random for all random types? And he's like, nah. He's like, kind of get out of here, right? I'm like, yeah, okay, right. I mean, that makes sense. I just can't think of any other language that it would be that easy and powerful. Yeah, my personal interests have been with Clojure, with education. Natural language is something I'm interested in. So kind of my meandering way to meeting up with Tim was, prior to that, I had this open source library where you could basically, just through user level macros, you could basically define a map where you translate all the keywords in Clojure from English into language X of your choice, human language X or natural language X of your choice. Just define that in a couple of map data structures, and that's it. And then through your own user level macros, you can basically transform Clojure from English into just any language of your choice. And I thought that was kind of interesting, and still trying to work through like if there is any practical ideas. But of course, like education, programming literacy, especially in places where English isn't quite as accessible, I think is a really interesting use case. And I'm still using it. Like right now, I'm trying to manually create a word stemmer for using the rules of the language I speak with my parents, which is called Thummel. And zippers, I think, is like when you have which is basically a functional data structure for a tree. I think that's a great choice for trying to traverse a tree in a sane and easy way. So what was interesting, kind of going back to what Tim was talking about, so he had a quote from Steve Yegi, and I'll leave my comments about Steve Yegi aside. When I was working at Nest, my mentor, my teammate, and he was my mentor, and he was also my manager at some point. Like, I mean, I still look up to him even now. I mean, he's just incredibly smart. He's like done so many things and learned so many languages, and is always just continually learning new technologies and things. So, he's seen assembly, he's done C, Perl, Java, JavaScript, Python, Scala. And I think seeing me and seeing kind of the cool things that I could do, or the things that were unique and powerful, he committed himself to, he decided that, winter break, I'm going to go and learn Clojure. And then he goes and he tries to do it, and he comes back and he's like, I just couldn't do it. And in fact, he actually tried learning Clojure, I think 3 times, not just 2, but 3 times. And for some reason, of all the things that he's learned, like, from Docker, from Angular, and all these languages and frameworks, tools, like Clojure is the one thing that he couldn't crack. And so the latest time that he tried to do it, he pulled that joy of Clojure, because he's like, I think this is a book that speaks to me, because I'm a guy who can pick stuff up. I don't need to be like, I don't need to have things sugar coated or whatever. And he always got stuck at roughly chapter 8 out of 17. Chapter 8 is the chapter on macros. And chapter 8 is like telling you not just what macros are and how to use them. It's like, this is how you write macros. And that's where the point where he's just trying to understand it before he moves on. And he's just like, I just can't wrap my head around it. That's where he just gets into a loop, and then boom. Yeah, he seg faults mentally, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what it is, but that's where he kind of, just couldn't get past it. So, I mean, I was always disappointed, because I mean, someone like him, when he learns Clojure, would be a great advocate and a great power user, and, a welcome addition to the community. So that aside, I've had questions about, like, what are the barriers to getting Clojure adopted in a place like a large tech company, such as the ones that I've had experience with. And I would say that depending on the company and the existing tooling around a language like Java may actually be good enough that maybe you kind of have to sell it better, or maybe there has to be existing tooling in the language of your choice that you're trying to really sell that can match the kind of functionality that they get. So right now, there are things that are, these are open source things now that are part of the tool chain. Like, one is called Error Prone, and it does static analysis on Java code, and it will tell you all the warnings and errors that it sees. So, like, we have it internally, but it's open source. They have like a Fluent version of a logger, so it has the benefits of performance and the benefits of Fluent style, readability or whatnot. And actually, Clojure logging, like tools.logging, is actually pretty good. It gets you the performance benefits, and it's actually even more concise. But Fluent logger is probably good enough. There's style guides, and like I said, there's tooling around the style guides. But the style guides also will help you, I guess, avoid falling into pitfalls. It kind of just straitjackets you into not doing the wrong thing for a subset of what is quote unquote the wrong thing. And then there's like really good training and materials and libraries and whatnot to fill in any gaps. So with all of that, it's like, you know, if you think Clojure is really good, can it do all that? And if not, then there's this level of like risk mitigation and confidence, and the things that all these new employees that come, you know, employees come and go, they mostly come, hopefully. And there's just always new people. And can you convey this culture and this dedication to a certain level of quality? Can you ensure that, right? And I think once you scale up, it becomes a harder task. So then you resort to these kinds of things. And in my notes, I have it written as all of this stuff mitigates the crappiness of Java as a language. Those are my notes, right? That's my opinion, but and then, you know, I think there's also a little bit of perhaps that barrier to entry might be just the fear of dynamic languages. And I mean, I think and hope Spec solves that and will continue to get better and continue to like really get towards that mythical sweet spot between static and the whole static and dynamic trade-off. You know, JavaScript and Python get a pass just because of their applicability in certain domains and just their existence, their pre-existence prior to a lot of these companies. But, you know, TypeScript, Go, Dart, you know, TypeScript was created at Microsoft, but Go and Dart were created at Google. And, you know, why do they exist? You know, are they, you know, they clearly are filling some sort of void, right? Otherwise, why would you bother? So yeah, you know, so ultimately, like the tooling needs to exist just to kind of make sure that new developers don't do the wrong thing. And that's just something to keep in mind when we want to really make things easy, not just for developers, but also for the companies that need to put together large projects. Yeah, so I guess another question is that I've had is, you know, are there people at Google who are still Clojurists, you know, even on the side? And yeah, that's definitely true. You know, we have a little mailing list and we talk about stuff, and people are still just trying to, even if it's for side projects or even if it's just for temporary exploration, people are just doing stuff. There's, you know, you're allowed to play around and experiment with things. For sure. I mean, no one's going to tell you can't. And in some way, like the story of me getting into Google in the first place came through Clojure. So the job I had before Nest was in downtown San Francisco, and the Clojure West conference was just basically a couple blocks down the road. So I went there, and I was talking with Islou Greenberg after she presented at that particular Clojure West. And then she was talking, and then at some point she was like, "Are you looking for a job? Because here's my card." And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. You don't even know me, and you just gave me your card saying that you would refer me. I'm like, at least let me send you my resume so that, you know, I'm not like, you know, I'm not going to bring down your reputation or something. But that was the trust that she placed in me, and she was a referral. So, I mean, that was awesome. So yeah, I mean, and for many reasons, I feel like Clojure got me in the door, and the skills allowed me to hang alongside these really smart people and kind of fake it until I made it. And I think it still helps me today, and to in order to really be able to make decisions among different trade-offs in a way, I think that helps. So yeah, anyways, so that's just a little bit of a rundown of kind of like my recent experience with Clojure, or lack thereof, and what's and everything in between at my full-time work, and you know, where I see some of the gaps that hopefully we can kind of patch up in terms of a community. So Tim or Dave, if you guys are around, over to you.
Did anyone have any questions?
I'm interested in seeing the content of the course, and we'll share it out in the in the group and with the link and everything. But I was curious what concepts are, I guess, the hardest to teach or so unique to the language that someone who would be a standard imperative programmer wouldn't would have the hardest time getting it. So macros might be one, or lazy sequences or something like that. What tends to be take the biggest activation energy to get someone over when learning Clojure for the first time?
From my opinion, is just the number of functions available is a bit daunting, especially when it comes to like family sequences and that sort of thing. It kind of, people see all these options and they don't know what tools to reach for. So I think a big obstacle is just getting up to speed with the grammar of all the different ways to talk about. Most of them are naming loops, right? Because we're used to being able to write a loop. We know how to construct the loop. It's very easy. There's only, for, I, and blah, and then you've got all your logic in there. And the big difference with Clojure is now you can start naming some of these things as a reduction or a map, and then you can compose those. And that's really what gives you a lot of leverage in Clojure. But it's also what people struggle with in making the shift between what they're used to doing and what they're doing now is getting the vocabulary of all those different ways on operating the data.
So it's like loops. It's not, figuring out where you're declaring state. It's not anything. It's like loops. Loops is if they get through loops, then it's clear sailing from there.
Yeah, mostly, I think. Yeah, I mean.
I would actually offer another thing too. I wouldn't say it's clear sailing just once you get past loops.
Hilarious, but yeah, go on.
Yeah. So I would say what I've seen, and I kind of had this myself in the beginning, was if you come from a background. So this is where some of your experience, like Tim was saying, your preconceptions might actually be a bit of a hindrance. If you have experience writing in languages that, have this object-oriented programming paradigm, this OOP thing, even if it's like Python or Ruby, where it's not necessarily front and center, but you're not writing big programs, but it's there, and you may come across it. It doesn't matter. Like, you've probably seen it very, very much in your previous programming experience. So then the question becomes, okay, well, where do I put these functions? You told me to write. Okay, I got the loops. I put stuff in functions, but how do I organize my code? Where does it go? How do I make sense of all this? Like, where do I put my state? Like, where are my variables? It's just, and I think that part gets a little bit tricky for people.
So do you guys address that in your text? That's the kind of thing that's hard to do in like for Clojure, right?
I don't have a good solution for that. I will just reiterate what Elango said, and on an even smaller scale, one thing that people struggled with in the course a lot was namespaces, like just calling the file a slightly wrong name that doesn't match the namespace, things like that, and just not being able to get namespaces to work. So it's definitely a point of concern of how do you organize your code and how the namespaces work and that sort of thing. Yeah, I don't think in 2 days you can really get into a code organization. I feel like that's something that has to come a bit later. So necessarily you have to kind of just focus on solving smaller problems in a quick course. But I think in terms of code organization, if you're interested in code organization, again, just reading projects out there, and there's a lot of open source Clojure projects that you can just look at and see how they organize their code and just kind of do it by assimilation.
One of the things I was going to throw out there is that, to me, I think Clojure is a very principled language, but it's also very pragmatic. And the way in which it's pragmatic is very reactive. Like, if you watch any of these talks, it's always like, this is wrong, right? Everything he talks, he'll bring up a slide and he'll say, like, everything you see here is wrong, and this is better, right? It's not like this is best, and there's no context to what you might compare it to. So one of the things that I found is like the biggest thing is that you're sort of, especially if you're talking to someone who comes from a Java OO background, you're actually trying to articulate that kind of everything you know is wrong. And you have to check that in at the door, or else none of this is going to make any sense to you. And that's kind of why I was asking about the functional programming so late in it. It's like, to various degrees of success I've had, it's always been the opposite around. You get them all sold on all the principles, and then you say, this is the thing that actually makes those principles like pragmatic to use. But I always think it's like really hard to get people who are in that ceiling of power, as you were talking about it, to really see that there's something that they might be lacking.
I'll just monopolize the stage and ask another question quick. We talked, you know, I tried to ask, like, what's the point where people hit a brick wall and they just can't, and they can't, you know, relate, or they have a real hard time jumping that to continue. What's the jewel? The jewel of that question is, like, where do you see people have the aha moments? Hopefully the aha moments happen before the brick wall so that people continue and power through it. For your students, what are the ahas that say, oh, there's something really interesting here?
I think it's when you start parsing functions to other functions around and see how you can create something really powerful in a very small amount of code. I think that's when people start getting really interested in Clojure, is that, like, this tiny bit of code does, like, in Java, I have to make all these patterns and stuff or whatever. So I think a lot of people get hooked at the point where you're parsing functions to other functions.
Even for people who come from, like, sort of functional languages like JavaScript or Python or something, for them, is it further down, or is it just so much better in Clojure that that's still the moment when they get into third year?
Well, I mean, everyone comes from a different background, so it's hard to answer that, except to say that I think different people obviously value different things. If people who have worked in functional languages before, I think, are more attracted to Clojure's ability to operate in the JavaScript world and the Java world, and the ability to not have any types around and just have, like, focus on the concise thing that you're actually expressing. Maybe I'm putting a bit of myself into this, but I like one of the things I really love about Clojure is building ClojureScript applications. Like, I really think it's just way more fun than anything else. Like, it's just really quick to develop something. Like, it feels like you're just manipulating HTML, but in a way more compact form than I've done in any other context. So certainly, like, what I love about Clojure at the moment is the ClojureScript world, and I feel actually that's probably, in terms of adoption, a bigger and richer market for Clojure. And so it's possible that ClojureScript is going to be way more popular than Clojure if it isn't already. I think to an extent it is, because I know, like, I write blog posts, and the ones that are about Clojure are not as popular as the one about ClojureScript. And so, like, I can see it in my participation in the community. And yeah, it's a big market.
I guess if I could tack on to that answer, when you talk about aha moments, I guess I can't speak to the deep epiphany aha moments. I can from my workshop days speak to the more superficial, gimmicky. Hey, this is cool, right? And there was, like, a whoa, kind of like magic trick kind of moment or two. And then there's a better answer to that. So in the workshops, I had people first start a REPL on their machine just at the command line, and they would do some stuff. And then I would have them use Clojure.inspector, and then I would say, okay, now, like, here's some data, run this function, and run this function, and it'd make something kind of complicated. And then I would say, run inspect on that, or inspect. So then there was, like, inspect would, I think, do any kind of random data structure, and then you could do inspect table. And so if it was a list, you know, it kind of, I think it might give you a table. And then if it were a map, it would give you the swing tree kind of thing. But it was like, it's cool. It's like this thing just popped up out of my REPL, and it was this visual GUI widget of my data. And then I don't think people have really thought about data in that way, that ability to really kind of manipulate or look at and interact with it. So that's kind of cool. And then the next magic trick I did during the workshop was say, okay, now let's switch over to light table. Okay, do this stuff. Okay, you know, you'll get some answer. Okay, now turn on like the live evaluation. And all of a sudden, like you can see the values flowing through your code, and it's like, whoa. And you know, even if you've seen JavaScript, just like to see the values flowing through your code every time you evaluate something live, and you know, it like dynamically changes as you evaluate something new. It's like that's pretty cool. But going back to what Tim said, I mean, I think Figwheel, I think that's in the Clojure script world, I think there's something fundamental about all the things that it puts together that really just blur the line between, like, you know, your live application and the code that you're writing, you know, hot reloading and stuff. I mean, I think the JavaScript world is starting to catch up to it. There's all these different tools and frameworks and things that you can do. But I mean, I'm starting to do front-end work for the very first time right now at work. And I mean, just even from what I've seen, I still kind of feel like there's something special and magical about Figwheel that I don't think the industry is entirely caught up to. That's just my naive assessment. So I think it's more than just a gimmick.
To add a few like real world examples to back up kind of what you've been talking about. So I work at Sally McBain. We've been heavily working towards adoption of Clojure and Clojure script for like any and all front-facing technologies and quite a few. And like we've had a whole slew of different aha moments for different people. Oftentimes it's usually the moment that they find the answer from the Clojure ecosystem that meets the need that they're most concerned about. Sometimes that's been like a brief discussion and explanation with someone about how powerful a Clojure REPL is and how it's realistically a method of interacting with a living, breathing system. Sometimes it's specifically Figwheel and how one of the directors over web technology is responsible for a lot of the stuff with mainsalary.com website. Just the ability for him to go through and do everything he needs to do on a daily basis in that very quick, very fast iteration. That response cycle is really small. For people that are more concerned about like test data, it's the ability to create the test data in the form that they need. I know from my personal, for me, it's been more the capabilities that the language has to bypass theoretical limits that exist in other languages teaching things like syntax or linguistic structures. But it's been very much like every person at the company that's actually put forth the effort to find the aha moment, they found it. And there's been some sort of answer that either the language itself has built in, baked in, or something that the community's already figured out and like passed on.
You guys have more questions for Tim and Elango? All right, well, thanks for coming, guys. Give a hand.